Hello, we're going to be talking about Theodicy, and we're using Livingston's text. We're in chapter 11. And first of all, the term Theodicy. It is a term that is coined by a philosopher named Leibniz, and he coins the term, and the origin of the two words that go together to make the term means something like justifying the ways of God. In other words, people who believe in God, especially a righteous God that's sovereign, are always asking why God did something, or why God let something happen, or why God would want things to be the way they are. And as we're going to see, it's very difficult to answer some of these questions. The term theodicy, though, has been greatly expanded since then. And today, when we talk about theodicy, we're talking about not just necessarily trying to understand why God would do something, but we've broadened the definition where we're talking about any explanation whatsoever about why there is evil in the world, why there's injustice in the world, why bad things happen to good people, why good things happen to bad people. And so we're going to be using theodicy in this broader context here in this chapter. However, the original application, referring to monotheism, referring to people who believe there's one God who's in control of everything, this is going to be the most problematic aspect of theodicy, as you will see. As we look at these different kinds of theodicies, we're going to be using a typology that was originally introduced by sociologist Max Weber. You might remember that we talked about Weber earlier in the course. He's famous for his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And I'm not going to return to what we talked about in our chapter on sociology there. But Weber's typology has been taken and has been kind of modified a little bit and expanded a little bit by a modern day sociologist named Peter Berger, associated with Boston College here. So a theodicy is an explanation. It's an explanation of why there's chaos in the world. There's moral chaos. You can remember all the way back to the beginning of the course, we talked about one of the characteristics of religion is that it teaches that there's some kind of a higher order. Now, whether you believe that higher order has to do with, heaven or whatever, the fact of the matter is we do not see any kind of justice in this world that we can count on. And this moral chaos really, really bothers us. If there is no meaning, no purpose for the sufferings that we're going through, then that would make life really, really difficult for people who are trying to, in some way, stay in harmony with the will of the divine. And people throughout history have been trying to figure out exactly, what is God's will in the way that things are happening. And if you can explain what's going on, that makes life a little bit more bearable. It helps you to avoid the conclusion that there is no meaning, that there is no purpose. And again, that's the kind of thing that humans do not like to conclude. Now today, philosophical atheists are very much the exception to the rule. They're the ones that are affirming that there is no explanation, there is no justice, there is no answer to these questions that we are incessantly asking about why something happened and, what does it accomplish and, how could it have been avoided? And, all of these kind of questions, the philosophical atheists would say have no answer. And so for the theistic or the religious person constantly asking these questions is just making them crazy. It's just making them miserable. And the sooner they accept that there are no such answers, obviously, the more quickly they'll evolve and they'll have a higher quality of life. But again, this chapter is not directed at the philosophical atheists that think that there is no answer to the questions of theodicy. The chapter is dedicated to the various types of explanations of theodicy that we encounter in the different religions. So on page 236, the second paragraph, it says, theodicies derive from the fact that evil and chaos must not only be endured, but also be explained if a sense of fatedness, meaningless, and despair are to be held at bay. And again, that's the whole purpose of it. And in the last sentence in that paragraph, it says what humans seek most is not happiness, but it's the assurance that, evil notwithstanding, life has meaning and purpose. People can go through all kinds of inconvenient situations and unjust situations if they believe that there's some meaning to it, that there's some kind of purpose in it. It's the moral chaos that offends them. And so this is why humans are always looking to answer these questions. And so when we said that religion always teaches that there's some kind of a higher order, the higher order is where all of these questions supposedly have answers that make sense. For the balance of page 236 and 237, Livingston is just giving us an overview of what he's going to go through in the chapter, and instead of going through the overview, let's just go through the chapter. The one thing I will point out, though, at the top of 237 is what we've mentioned before, and even in this video I've alluded to, and that is when you get to the problem of theodicy, Western monotheism faces unique problems because of the fact that one of the attributes of God is supposed to be that he is all-powerful, that would be omnipotent, and he's supposed to be sovereign, in control of everything. It's supposed to be going according to his will. But we have another attribute of God, that is that God is perfectly just and perfectly righteous. And as such, God does not want evil to exist. God does not want injustice to exist. This is not his will. As a perfect God and a righteous God, he could never want these things to exist. Now, the problem is when you take these attributes and you put them together and you say, here is a God that's in control of everything, and he doesn't want suffering and evil to exist. Well, then suffering and evil should not exist, right? If he doesn't want them to exist and he's in control of everything, they would not exist. And this is the huge problem of theodicy in monotheism. We've talked a little bit about it. We've talked about in Protestant theology, how Protestant theology split really kind of down the middle in terms of Calvinist and Arminian answers to the question of evil in the world. And Calvinism, of course, hangs on to the idea of God's sovereignty, almost, reverently, sacredly, and redefines God's righteousness, God's compassion. And what they would say is that if something that is happening according to God's will seems to you to be unrighteous, it's because you lack the wisdom of God. You don't see what God sees. You don't see where it's going or what God's doing. And so who are you to judge God? And the Calvinists would hang on to this idea of God's sovereignty and redefine God's righteousness or God's justice. On the other hand, the Arminian hangs on to the idea of God's righteousness, God's compassion, God's justice, and says, no, God does not will that evil exists, ideally, or that injustice exists, ideally. But in his sovereignty, God has chosen not to be sovereign for a period of time while events are transpiring the way he knows they're going to. And at some point in the future, when evil has kind of come to a head, so to speak, to its climax, then God is going to once again get involved, and he is going to fix the problem. And usually we're talking about a last days battle between good and evil that is going to inaugurate some kind of a paradisal kingdom or something like that. We've talked about these differences before. Again, the Arminian hangs on to the idea of God's justice, God's kindness, but kind of redefines God's sovereignty, whereas the Calvinist hangs on to God's sovereignty and redefines God's righteousness. This should be familiar to you because we've talked about it before, but I'm bringing it up again in case you missed it, because this is why the problem of theodicy and monotheism is such a big problem, more so than in any other kind of religion. Monotheism is the big problem. Now, we were talking about, in the very beginning of the course, when we were talking about different kinds of theisms, we talked about the beginning of the acknowledgement that the monotheistic tradition had never answered these questions well. And in fact, every answer that it had proposed, every paradigm that monotheistic religion had proposed, didn't work. It fell apart. And whatever explanation you give for why in a particular situation God works this way is going to fall apart pretty quickly. because you're going to get another situation that looks the same way, and yet it's going to have a different outcome. So why did God act differently in this situation? And none of the paradigms have worked. They all fall apart very, very quickly. And we talked about a theism that is really a monotheistic theism. The people involved in it, this is post-Enlightenment, by the way, we're talking the 1700s and beyond. The people that believe this are really monotheists. They believe one God exists and one God created the earth, but they do not believe that God is involved in the affairs of this earth anymore. And the reason they don't believe that is because there is no explanation as to why a God, or how a God who is all-powerful and sovereign, and yet righteous and compassionate, could will for the world to be the way it is now. There's no explanation for that. And by the way, these people are right. What did we call these people in the theisms when we were studying the theisms? We mentioned that a couple examples of people we know well that adhered to this kind of a theistic philosophy were Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. And we called them deists because they still believe in God. They still believe that a God created the world. They see the evidence of intelligent design. But they don't believe that God is still ordering the affairs of earth. He's not immanent. He's not involved in the affairs of earth, because if he is, he would have to explain why it is he's choosing to do things that seem completely against his nature. And no explanations of this have ever worked. And so deists reject these explanations. And instead they decide that God is not involved in the sequence of events in the world today. Now, they may believe that at some point in the future, God will get involved again. Many deists believe that after this life, you will, give account for your actions to God. So they believe in living ethically, according to monotheistic principles, but they have stopped trying to answer questions as to, why did God let this happen? Or why did God do this? They reject that there is any answer to these questions that works. Hopefully you remember discussing deism. We went on past this, and we talked about agnosticism. And agnosticism, the big difference here is agnostics don't even necessarily hang on to the idea that there is a God, or that there's one God, or that any intelligence created the earth. That, you can't know any of those things for sure, obviously. And agnosticism rejects the, how shall we say, doctrinal teaching that there's anything in this regard that you can know at all. You can't know that God exists. You can't know what God's will is. And anybody who claims to know what God's will is and speaks for God, the agnostic rejects, from the beginning. Nobody has that power. Nobody has that connection to God. And even if you did, certainly you could not prove that what you're saying is really God's will. And the fact that there are so many different people speaking for God that do not agree on why God let certain things happen or why God did certain things, however you see it, really adds to the problem of these thousands of people claiming to speak for God. Which one of them is correct? And we had a conversation about this, again, in the beginning of the class, so I don't want to go back and rehash the whole thing. But agnostics are saying A means not, gnosis means some kind of a revelation of knowledge of God. And what they're saying is there is no, revelation of God to humans regarding who he is, what he is, or why he does what he does that you can prove is correct. And so many people that think that there's an explanation differ with other people that have different explanations. So the agnostic just says that you can't know for sure. And the agnostic immediately is done listening to anyone who claims to know for sure, or who claims to speak for God. Remember, we talked about this. I hope so. So both of these reactions, first deism and later agnosticism, are reactions to people who claim to speak with the authority of God. And all of the different problems that this has brought about during the centuries, from, causing wars to persecutions. And today, we're really tired of this. And I mentioned before, I gave a couple of examples, 9/11, if you remember. Why would God let this happen? Or from another point of view, why did God cause this to happen? Why would God want 3,000 innocent people to die on 9/11? Why? And there's still a tradition in this country and other places on earth where people of God think they have the authority to answer these questions. And right after 9/11, probably the most famous pastor involved with the movement that we call the moral majority, later it's called the Christian Coalition, was Jerry Falwell, Sr., who's gone now, no longer with us. But he went on TV and told everybody that the reason that God, allowed or willed or caused 9/11, however you want to look at it, was because God was mad because of gay marriage and abortion. And he went on to list some other things that God was pissed about, but I guess God was really mad about abortion and gay marriage, and that was why 9/11 happened, because God was angry about these things. The outcry was huge, and hopefully you remember we talked about this before. The outcry was huge, and Falwell had to actually go back on TV very quickly and say, look, I didn't say that right, didn't mean that right, sorry about that. Another example that I gave you too was more recently, about a decade ago, when we had the great earthquakes in Haiti. And of course, all of the devastation and suffering that caused. Pat Robertson, a very, very old, TV personality, who's still alive as of the time of this recording and is still on TV, still explaining why God does what he does. But he went on TV on his show and explained that the reason for the earthquakes in Haiti was because when the nation was being founded, the new leaders of Haiti had made some kind of a pact with the devil so that the devil would give them power and success and all that. And now, basically, century and a half later or whatever, it was time to pay up. The devil had come to collect. And of course, it's ridiculous. And, many people today, we don't even listen to this kind of thing. Anyone who claims to take any kind of a natural tragedy and say, oh, this was God's will and he did it on purpose, and I'm the one who's going to tell you why because I have this prophetic anointing. We're to the point today where most people just do not listen to this kind of stuff. On the bottom of 237 here, Peter Berger, this is a quote from him, he's actually talking about social ritual and how it transforms the individual event, the individual crisis or whatever, into a typical case. This is important. If you can explain how what you're going through is something everybody goes through, it's something you're supposed to go through, it's something that challenges everybody, and here's how you're supposed to respond to it, and this is what it means, and this is the purpose. It's much easier to go through things like that. It's when you think that it's not a typical case, that something has gone wrong, that this is somehow breaking the rules of the way the universe ought to be, that your existential suffering is great. Now, it's not just in terms of ritual that relativizes your suffering, if you will, but it's anything that makes you part of a larger story than your own. Okay? When soldiers go to battle and valiantly give their lives, it's not just because this is what they've chosen to do for themselves. Obviously, they're part of a much larger story. They're defending their nation, their homeland, the people that they love, the things that they believe in, and this makes their suffering meaningful. And it's the same kind of thing, for instance, if you look at apocalyptic theology, whether in the time of Jesus or today. There are people today that think we're going into the last age. The last days, which is what the apocalypse means. And if there is a cosmic battle going on between good and evil, and everything that you are suffering now is just the outworking of this cosmic battle, but hey, you're on the right side, and good is going to win, and you're going to be rewarded. Now the sufferings you're going through don't seem so bad because they mean something. They mean something bigger than you. They mean something bigger than your life. There's a purpose that transcends you, and so that makes it endurable. That makes it again meaningful and purposeful because it makes you part of something larger than yourself. You can also look at it in terms of like a tribal society or something. Just the fact that you are part of the tribe and your identity, your existence, your purpose is all about fulfilling your role as part of the tribe. That relativizes your situation in such a way that it makes it a whole lot easier to go through whatever sufferings or challenges you have to go through. In fact, it makes it a lot easier to even deal with your own demise. Now, what we're talking about here is individual experience. And moving on here to the top of page 238, Livingston is talking about how ordinary people do theodicy. And I don't mean doing theodicy in terms of trying to tell everybody else, what God's doing or explain things. They have to decide for themselves what unfortunate situations, scary situations, crisis situations, tragedies, what they mean in their life. And if you can respond to these things in the right way, and it ends up teaching you something, making you a better person, giving you some kind of power you didn't have before, well, then you can say that the crisis or the tragedy was actually a good thing. And there's an example here. And again, this is all completely subjective, but I mean, my whole question about what this means to me is fundamentally subjective. It's all about how I'm going to accept this. And it tells a story about an American soldier whose legs had been blown off by a landmine in Vietnam. And in his own acceptance of this fate, he had decided that somehow this was because of his role in certain actions that caused the death of innocent women and children in a Vietnamese village that was burned by him and his troop or whatever. And so he saw it as God's judgment on his own monstrous crime, and this is important, as a merciful release. In other words, I'm going to read this here because it's well worded. His personal suffering strangely satisfied his sense of justice, and he accepted his condition, not grudgingly, not stoically, but with an apparent sense of relief, satisfaction, and peace. The young man was engaging unawares in Theodicy. He was saying, why did this happen to me? And because he came up with a reason that was a just reason, that confirmed the fact that there was justice in the universe, he accepted his punishment. And it wasn't just because he understood why it happened, but in a sense, it was redemptive. I mean, he'd been punished for his sin, which made it easier for him to go on and believe that maybe he could be forgiven, maybe forgive himself. And so this is a good example of how common people are doing theodicy in a very subjective way in their own life, asking, why did this happen to me? And, how do I respond to this? Am I supposed to learn something? Am I supposed to change something? We ask these kind of questions a lot, even if you're not religious. If you don't believe that, God is judging you, or that, there's any kind of a divine power that is somehow pursuing justice in the universe, even if you believe there's no meaning and purpose in that sense at all, if you go through a really, really tragic situation, even the wise philosophical atheist is going to say, what's the most positive way for me to respond to this situation? In what way can I turn this to my good? In what way can I learn something that will benefit me later on? In what way can I respond that will make me a better person? And again, whether you believe in God or not, we, in a sense, are asking ourselves how unfortunate situations or unjust situations can be turned to our advantage, how we should respond to them in an advantageous way. It's more of a problem if you believe that there's a God in control, because then your answer has to somehow explain why God would choose for things to go the way that they've gone. In the next section, beginning at the bottom of 238, we get to our first category here, which is mystical participation. And the example is used here in terms of primal societies, tribal societies, where once again, one's identity is only meaningful because they are part of the tribe. And long after their life is over, the tribe is going to live on. And this so relativizes the way things affect them and their own suffering, that it makes it easier to endure, and again brings meaning and purpose into their lives. And we kind of talked about this a little bit just a minute ago. But this kind of mystical participation does not only take place in primal societies and tribal societies, but even in major world religions, even monotheistic religions. As I was talking about just a little bit ago, if you believe that you're involved in some great cosmic plan, some great cosmic struggle or something like that, it so relativizes your own sufferings and the way things affect you that it's easier to identify with this greater plan that you're involved with this greater group of people that you're involved with this greater struggle that you're involved with. And again, makes it easier to see your own sufferings as the inevitable result of this, as more of a typical case. And so mystical participation can be anywhere from primal societies, tribal societies, all the way to well-developed monotheistic apocalyptic theories, about the battle between good and evil going on in the last days, as some people believe we're going into today. On the top of 239, we talk about these theodicies of participation also being present in forms of mysticism. And mysticism obviously comes from the root word that means mystery. But when we talk about mystics, the proper narrow meaning of the term are people who have devoted their life to trying to experience to the greatest degree the mystery of their connection with God. They want to have the greatest realization or experience of God's presence and purpose in their life. And here, when he's talking about mysticism, he's using the term in a broader way. But he says that these forms of mysticism emphasize the absorption or annihilation of the self in its union with the divine. And he goes on and gives you some explanation here. And this paragraph here below is actually from William James. You'll remember we've talked about William James in a couple of contexts before, not only in terms of his understanding of the definition of religion, and in terms of what religious experience is all about. We talked about his important book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And so this is a quote from him, but it talks about someone being so overwhelmed by the glory, by the power of God, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, as Rudolf Otto would call it, that their own understanding of who they are and what they want and what they think, and all of this is relativized. In fact, it means absolutely nothing. To them, all they want is just to be a part of this great mystery, this wondrous God, this glory that they're experiencing. And they're more than happy to have their own identity, their own ideas, their own will absorbed into that. They're so overwhelmed by this glory of God. In the next section, we're talking about a future, this worldly theodicy. Now, before I go on, let me make something very clear, okay? Not all belief systems fall cleanly in one category. There are aspects of different kinds of theodicies, say in Christianity or in Judaism or in Islam. So the idea of a this worldly theodicy, especially in, say, apocalyptic Christianity, is coupled with other ideas. As we get farther in the chapter, we'll see a future otherworldly theodicy exists in Christianity, just like this worldly theodicy does, more or less in different forms of Christianity. So again, we'll get to this later, but I just want to point out that not every religion or every religious belief system employs only one kind of theodicy. Sometimes there's many different kinds of theodicy that all kind of work together, and different theodicies are used as explanations in different kinds of situations. So a future this worldly theodicy, the example given here is early Israel. And obviously we know we're talking about early pre-axial age Israel, where they weren't thinking of everybody being resurrected from the dead and living on in some other reality, but they were thinking of the fact that God was going to somehow fix this earth and was going to set them back up in their kingdom, in some kind of an eternal glorious kingdom. And so anything that is looking for some kind of a resolution on this earth, that the earth is going to be fixed. There's not going to be any more, pain, nor sorrow, nor famine, nor disease, nor warfare, nor death, nor dying. These kind of ideas we would call this worldly theodicy. And there's another term here. It says this worldly eschatology near the bottom of the page. This is a noun, eschatology, but it comes from another noun, eschaton. Eschaton means the last days. Any kind of teaching regarding the last days we would call eschatology. It's involving a teaching about the eschaton. When we say apocalyptic or apocalypse or apocalypticism, pick your term, we're talking about eschatology, but we're talking about a kind of eschatology where the people not only believe in the last days, but they actually believe they're in it, or that they see the prophetic signs that we're going into the last days at this particular time. So again, we're talking about some kind of a paradisal experience on this earth, in this world, rather than some other world that we've never conceived of beyond space and time or anything like that. Again, religions, Christianity is a great example, has both this worldly and otherworldly theodicies mixed in. So everything doesn't fall neatly in one category. There is one other thing he talks about here, an example of millenarian theodicy. In Christianity, You might have heard of premillennial dispensationalism, which is one of the major forms of Christian theology in the United States that is looking for, well, they have a whole progression of events, but there's going to be a tribulation period where the height of evil is realized, and some leader, generally called the Antichrist, is revealed, and some kind of a false prophet. And at this point, the final battle between good and evil that is going on in the cosmic realms comes to Earth, and we have this final apocalyptic battle. And after this battle, according to premillennial dispensationalism in Protestant Christianity, there's a period of time where Christ comes and reigns for 1,000 years on the earth. And this is why we call it millenarian theology, because it's for a millennium that Christ rules. And at the end of this 1,000 years, strangely enough, there's going to be another apocalyptic battle. Satan's actually going to be, I guess, get parole or something, let out of his spiritual prison, and he's going to cause another war. But after this second war is defeated, at that point, this earth is going to be completely done with, and God's going to create a new heaven and a new earth, and now we're into that otherworldly, theodicy. So that's just one example. There's many of them, but that's one example in a very common form of evangelical theology today, called premillennial dispensationalism, where we see aspects of this worldly theodicy and aspects of otherworldly theodicy, which we're going to get to in a bit. And there's an interesting story here too, from the bottom of 240 to 241, in case you haven't heard of it. Actually, it's not here. Where is it at? It's actually on 242, and a second full paragraph. It talks about the Millerites, and they were followers of a guy named William Miller. And he somehow came up with the knowledge of when Jesus was coming back to earth, and he predicted the exact date. This is in the 1800s, the 19th century. And so he had plenty of followers that believed this. And so when the earth was supposed to end on this date in 1843, a lot of his followers sold everything that they owned, and basically were standing out in a field waiting for Jesus to come back in white robes, And of course, the end didn't come. And this is often called in history, I don't know if it mentions it here, but it's often called the Great Disappointment, because of course Jesus didn't come back. Now, William Miller went back, and his answer was, oh my God, I forgot to carry the one. My math was off. And by the way, when apocalyptic predictions fail, there's three basic ways that people explain it. I mean, besides just saying I was crazy and I was wrong. They don't say that. But one of the ways is exactly what William Miller did. He said, I miscalculated. And so he comes up with another date. Now, the second date, it didn't work either. And so after the second date, we get to the need for another explanation. And this explanation is that something really, really did happen, actually. We just can't really tell it. We can't see it. The third explanation here, I'll go ahead and throw it in here before I continue the story. The third explanation is that because so many people listened to the prophecy and started praying and repenting to God, God had mercy and stopped this end time event from happening because everybody repented. So those are the three. Miscalculated the date. The last one I just said. God somehow has mercy because everybody's repenting, so he doesn't bring the judgment that was prophesied. And thirdly, that actually in some sense, what was promised did happen, but you just can't really tell that it happened. You have to just believe it. And this is what happened with some of the Millerites. You may not know this, but there are two religious groups today that, if you trace them back, they do come out of movements created by disappointed Millerite followers. And one of them is the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the other is the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, I'm not meaning to say anything bad about either of these groups at all, just that they came from people that were believing in this prophecy of William Miller that, of course, didn't turn out. But Jehovah's Witnesses are a really good example of explaining the disappointment in terms of the fact that something did happen that you can't really see, with your carnal senses. But in some way, Jesus did come back, and now he's closer, he's in the atmosphere, we've officially entered the last days. And so they believe in some sense that everything changed after that date, even though, of course, you can't perceive any changes. And so we see that an awful lot too. By the way, this kind of stuff happens all the time. Just in my own lifetime, I've seen so many predictions of when the world was going to end. I've seen so many apocalyptic interpretations of how, what was happening in the world was the outworkings of what was prophesied in this ancient prophecy. What we saw here in Zephaniah, it's actually happening today. And this is one of the characteristics of apocalypticism, by the way, is that somehow the ancient prophecies are happening today before our eyes. The ancient prophets were looking at today when they wrote down these prophecies, and that's one of the main characteristics of apocalypticism, by the way. Anyway, let's not spend any more time with this. We're going to go into otherworldly theodicy, and this is, of course, is that there is going to be some kind of a paradise that is beyond what we can conceive of now, beyond this universe, beyond all the limitations of this universe, and of course, with none of the suffering, none of the injustice of this universe involved in it. The examples that your author gives you here, of course, monotheistic religions, it talks about Christianity and Islam, but also a form of Mahayana that is looking forward to a heaven or a paradise. It's called Pure Land Buddhism, and your author doesn't call it that. In fact, there's another place in the book where he calls it Amidism, because the Buddha of the Pure Land in Japan is called Amida. In the Indian term would be Amitabha. The Chinese term would be Amidwo, but this is Pure Land Buddhism, although he doesn't name it here, that's looking for some kind of a heavenly paradise as well. So if you are believing in any way that the end of time is going to cause the end of this reality and a brand new reality is going to occur, a paradise, beyond all of the limitations of this world, then we would call this otherworldly theodicy. And most of you, just being exposed to monotheistic religion, probably are pretty familiar with this idea. Now, one of the other things that the author brings out here, and he's using the example of Shia Islam here, and I'm not sure, how many people might get some unfair ideas about Shia here, but he talks about martyrdom. But you don't need to talk about Shia Islam. You can talk about Christianity. You can talk about Judaism for that matter. But the idea is that those who are martyred for the cause, in promoting the idea of this new world that is coming, and the idea that this world should not be what we relate to, what we cherish, what we identify with, but we should speak out against the evil in this world. And whatever suffering we receive as a result of fighting against the evil in this world, even if we're martyred, even if we lose our life for it, it's okay. Because in the world to come, we're going to have great honor, and we're going to be rewarded for this above all other people. And this has been an idea in Christianity since, a century from the beginning of it. It's already well established here. So I don't want you to think, because the author is talking about Islam here, that somehow this is some kind of a problem with Islam. If it is, it's a problem with Christianity. It's a problem with many other forms of religion as well. There are many good people in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, who have willingly suffered death for what they believe in, because they believed that they should not in any way be motivated to deny the truth of what they believe, to give up their faith, and they would rather go to death than to give up this faith that they have held on to. But their death has great meaning for them, okay? There's no better way to die than refusing to stop believing in the God that you want to be with forever, that you believe has changed your life, that has brought meaning and purpose into your life. I'm not giving all of that up. If I have to die to hang on to that, I'll die to hang on to that. And that gives my death great meaning and purpose. And by the way, for the people that carry on in this world after you're dead, you become powerful encouragement for them. to be able to look to their martyrs, the people that willingly suffered for what they believed in, gives the people that are left behind on this earth great courage to go on. And again, relativizes their own sufferings in such a way that they're not a curse anymore. It's almost like a privilege to be able to suffer with those who one day are going to be the privileged ones. Hopefully you've read the chapter. If so, you know that in the next section, at the bottom of 243, we're getting into the section the author titles Dualism. Now, we know that we've gone a little bit into depth with this, and we have broadened the term dualism to refer to any kind of dualistic structure within which people make value judgment about what's true, what's a lie, what's good, what's bad. And but when the book is talking about dualism here, it is focusing a little bit more on Gnostic dualism, or what we would say is spirit-matter dualism. And it actually is talking about Gnosticism and some of the forms of Gnosticism, Mithraism, Manichaeism, and then it lists Gnosticism as if that's another form. But basically, Mithraism and Manichaeism are forms of Gnosticism. Anything that believes that this material world is flawed, is evil, is imperfect, and we want to go back to some kind of pure spiritual state. Remember we talked about that? So the author is not going to present this in exactly the same way, but he is going to present it in terms of some kind of a battle between a good and evil, and in the case of Gnosticism, between the spirit world and the fleshly world. And So we've already talked an awful lot about this. What I want to go ahead and read this, but what I want to bring out is, once again, we can take all of the three things that we've talked about so far. Technically, we can take all four of them, and we can say they all are present, say, in Christianity. The idea that I'm mystically participating in something beyond myself, relativizes all of my suffering. I'm a part of something bigger, and that makes it okay. A future this worldly theodicy, yes, God's going to fix this world. A future otherworldly theodicy, yes, one day I'll be a part of this heavenly kingdom, it's beyond anything I can imagine. And then, the dualistic idea that there is a battle between good and evil going on, and good will one day win. These are four different theodicies, but again, everything that doesn't fall into one category, all four of these theodicies exist in Christianity and in many other religions as well. There are multiple theodicies that are applied, sometimes in different contexts, in different ways, maybe different sects or denominations or variations of the religion hang on to one theodicy more than another. But again, all of the four that we've seen so far are in some sense present in Christianity. And the way the author is using dualism, of course, here, is he says dualistic theodicy is not a prevalent doctrine in the modern world religions, either East or West. Talking about spirit matter dualism and Gnosticism, he is absolutely correct. Yes. But if you expand the meaning of the term dualism to refer to good and evil dualism in the monotheistic religions, or yin and yang, or anything else, then obviously dualism is present all over the place. So he's using dualism in a very narrow sense to refer to spirit matter dualism. Hopefully you remember this at the beginning of the semester. I think it was a second class or something. We talked about the different forms of dualism. So he's talking about spirit matter dualism here. And yes, that doesn't exist in Christianity or any other religions. But if you're talking about cosmic dualism in a more general sense, yes, that certainly does exist. The idea that there's a battle between good and evil going on, and good one day will win the battle. If you define dualism that way, then yes, it is very much a part of many different religious traditions today. But as he said, and is completely correct in saying, spirit-matter dualism of Gnosticism is not prevalent in any of the major religions today. And again, this is exactly what we talked about when we were talking about different kinds of dualism. Going into the next section, I'm going to talk a lot about this. And it's a section on the karma samsara theodicy. Now, one of the things that the author points out here, and I told you before, is that the author has already presented some of the ideas of karma, for instance, and suffering in Theravada Buddhism. Technically, we're kind of going in the wrong order, because Theravada Buddhism was actually a response to and a rejection of a lot of the ideas in axial age Hinduism, that were developing in axial age Hinduism. And so it would have made a lot more sense if we could have studied these ideas in Hinduism and then moved on to Theravada Buddhism as a response to them. But the author of this book did not present those things in that order. And maybe in terms of presenting the themes, the order is a good one. Because if you remember, the last theme was views of the human problem. What's wrong with the human being? And the author thought it more important to address that topic, that theme, before addressing the topic of theodicy. And so we're looking at these religions in a backwards order. So whatever we've talked about with Theravada Buddhism, this is not necessarily going to correlate in every way. In fact, in many ways it won't. While both religions believe in samsara, the wheel of rebirth, if you will, their goals are entirely different. Moksha in Hinduism is very different from nirvana in Buddhism. And the idea of the human soul in Hinduism is not present in Buddhism at all. The idea of dharma is defined very, very differently in both of these two religions. So there's some differences here. What we're going to talk about now is the basic ideas in Hinduism regarding karma, dharma, samsara, and moksha. I'm going to leave the book now, and I'm going to actually do a presentation on these concepts that I think will make it a lot easier to understand the karma, samsara, theodicy, and why it is the most intelligible. It's the one that makes the most sense. Weber points this out, and we can see it clearly. Most of the other theodicies, you're believing in something that on some level you have to suspend your judgment on. Karma makes an awful lot of sense. Now, it doesn't make much sense the way a lot of people think of it today. For instance, on social media, say somebody had something very bad happen to them. Say a girl was completely used by this guy who betrayed her and had affairs and finally just cast her off like nothing. And, she's now in an existential crisis and, crying and, on her social media page, people will be posting things like, you hang in there, karma's going to get him, girl. Oh, I'd hate to see when karma gets him. Wouldn't we all like to believe that? Wouldn't we all like to believe that when someone with no conscience whatsoever inflicts suffering on another person, that karma is going to bitch slap the hell out of them? Unfortunately, it often doesn't happen. So those that are saying, don't worry, karma's going to get him, well, maybe it will, but maybe it won't. And if you want to give me 10 examples of how karma took care of somebody the way it ought to, you're doing what we call cherry picking. Cherry picking means if I have, say, 1,000 stories, okay, and 900 of those stories prove me wrong, but 100 of the stories prove me right, so I only tell you about the 100 stories. I can tell you 10, cases where karma, seems to have worked properly, but for every 10 cases, I can tell you at least 100 where it didn't work. So the idea that people always get what they deserve, obviously that doesn't work. We already know that. So, people today who are saying, oh, karma's going to get him, in a sense, they're kind of willfully ignorant. They're not looking at history. If that idea had ever worked, then everybody on earth would believe in it. We wouldn't have so many different ideas about this, from final judgment to whatever. So it really doesn't. Sometimes it works, most of the time it doesn't. So what about karma does make sense? Well, karma, when you understand all of the different ways that it works, it's not just all about what comes around, goes around in this lifetime. Wouldn't we like that to be the case? Where in this lifetime, people would get what they justly deserve. In fact, what we would really like is what we call instant karmatic return, where if you do something good, you're very quickly rewarded. And if you do something bad, you're very quickly slapped down. And that certainly doesn't happen. Sometimes it'll never happen in someone's lifetime that they get what they deserve. So let's talk a little bit more about this, and you'll understand more how karma really works.